November 1968, Monterey, California. The admissions window at Silas B. Hayes Army Community Hospital closes at 4:30. The clerk tells Walter Pruitt he is $47 short. Walter Pruitt has been standing at that window for 20 minutes. He has already emptied his wallet. In the waiting area behind him, a tall man in a dark jacket sets down a magazine he has not been reading. He has been watching the window for the last 10 minutes. Nobody recognizes him yet. Here is the story. Walter Pruitt is 51 years old. He has a compressed vertebra in his lower back from a mortar blast outside Incheon in the winter of 1950, a partial hearing loss in his left ear from the same morning, and a femur that healed slightly wrong after a field surgery in January 1951 that gives him a limp so familiar now he no longer notices it. He has been living with the back pain for 17 years. For most of those years, he managed it the way men of his generation manage things, without comment, with aspirin, with the understanding that complaint is a transaction that costs more than it returns. In October, the pain stopped being manageable. He drove himself to the VA office in Salinas. He waited 4 hours. He was told his eligibility paperwork had lapsed during a period in 1963 when he had moved between addresses and a renewal notice had gone to the wrong house. Reinstating his coverage would take 8 to 12 weeks. The woman behind the desk said this with the particular exhausted neutrality of someone who has said the same thing too many times and has run out of ways to soften it. Walter drove home. He took 4 aspirin. He came back the next morning and the morning after that. He filled out the forms they gave him. He gathered the documents they requested. He mailed them to the address he was given and waited for the acknowledgement that was supposed to arrive within 10 business days and arrived on the 17th. The paperwork moved at the pace. Paperwork moves when nobody is personally inconvenienced by its slowness, which is to say, it moved at almost no pace at all, and each week that passed was a week of the pain being what it was, which by November was considerable. In November, his neighbor Frank Ibarra, who had served in the Pacific and who understood without being told what Walter was carrying, drove him to the Army hospital in Monterey and told him to try the admissions window directly. Frank had heard that cash payment for initial consultation was possible while the VA paperwork was processed. It was worth trying. Walter had $63 in his wallet, which was most of what he had until the end of the month. The consultation fee was $110. The clerk at the admissions window, a young woman in a pale blue uniform who was not unkind, explained this carefully. She explained the billing structure and the payment options and the possibility of a payment plan. Walter listened to all of it. He put his $63 on the counter. He asked if there was any arrangement that could be made. The clerk said she was sorry. The policy was the policy. She said it gently, but she said it. $47 short was $47 short. Walter picked up his $63. He folded them back into his wallet. He thanked her. He turned around. The waiting area was standard government issue. Plastic chairs in rows, fluorescent light, a low table with magazines from 3 months ago. 4 people waiting. One of them was a tall man in a dark jacket who had come in 10 minutes earlier and taken a seat near the window without speaking to anyone. He had picked up a magazine and had not turned a page since. He stood up when Walter turned around. Clint Eastwood was 38 years old. He was in Monterey for 2 days between commitments, staying at a place on the water, doing the thing he did when he had time between productions, which was as little as possible, and as quietly as possible. He had come to the hospital that morning for a routine matter of his own that had taken less time than expected. He had been about to leave when Walter Pruitt walked up to the admissions window. He had not left. He crossed the waiting area to where Walter was standing. Walter looked at him the way a man looks at someone he half recognizes and cannot immediately place, the face familiar from somewhere, the context wrong. Mr. Pruitt. Walter looked at him. I was at the window, Eastwood said. I heard what you need. Walter straightened slightly. I'm not looking for charity, he said. His voice was flat and without self-pity. The voice of a man who has said the same thing before and expects to have to say it again. I know that, Eastwood said. Can I ask you something? Walter waited. Where did you serve? Walter looked at him for a moment. Korea, 7th Infantry Division, Incheon through the Chosen. Eastwood nodded once. He did not say anything immediately. He understood what Incheon through the Chosen meant in the winter of 1950. Most Americans in 1968 did not. Eastwood had done enough reading and enough listening to men who had been there to understand it precisely. The Chosen Reservoir Campaign was 17 days in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, in which American and Allied forces were encircled by Chinese troops and fought their way out in conditions that military historians would later describe as among the most brutal in the history of modern warfare. The men who came back from Chosan came back with frostbite, with permanent injuries, with a particular knowledge of what human endurance actually looks like at its outer edge. They came back to a country that was already tired of one war and not yet fully aware it was entering another, and they were thanked in the bureaucratic, attenuated way that governments thank soldiers when the emergency is past and the paperwork remains. What most people who had not been there did not understand about Korea, and specifically about Chosun, was the cold. Not the cold as an inconvenience or a hardship, but the cold as a primary tactical fact of the engagement, as present and as lethal as the enemy on the other side of the perimeter. Men lost fingers to it, men lost feet. Men died of it in positions their units could not reach. The weapons jammed, the rations froze solid. The medical supplies thickened to uselessness in temperatures that the equipment had not been designed to handle. Walter Pruitt had been 19 years old when he went into that reservoir, and 20 when he came out the other side, and the winter of 1950 had left its marks in his bones and his back and his left ear, and in the particular stillness he carried that people who knew him had learned not to mistake for coldness. Walter Pruitt had been thanked in exactly that way. He had come home with a bad back and a bad leg and a left ear that heard the world at 3/4 volume, and he had worked a ranch outside Salinas for 15 years and asked for very little and received approximately that. Eastwood reached into his jacket. He put $47 on the counter beside Walter's elbow. He did not make a presentation of it. He set it down the way you set something down that belongs somewhere, and you are simply returning it to its place. Walter looked at it, then at Eastwood. "I told you I don't take charity. It's not charity. You earned it in 1950. The government just hasn't paid you yet. Consider this an advance on what they owe you." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I don't know who you are exactly." Eastwood told him his name. Walter looked at him the way a man looks when a name lands and the face resolves into something known. "You were on that Western show," Walter said. "Rawhide." "I was. My kids watch that show," Walter said. "Every Friday." Eastwood nodded. Walter looked at the money on the counter. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw was tight. Something was working in his face that he was keeping controlled with the same discipline he had applied to the pain for 17 years. "I'll pay you back," he said. Eastwood picked up the $47. He walked with Walter to the admissions window. He set the money beside Walter's $63. He told the clerk the balance was covered. The clerk processed the payment. She slid a receipt across the counter. She told Walter his consultation was scheduled for 2:30. Walter took the receipt. He stood at the counter a moment without turning around. Then he turned. Eastwood was already moving toward the door. "Mr. Eastwood." Eastwood stopped. Walter Pruitt was not a man who said things he didn't mean or said them with more weight than he had thought through. He stood in the fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room with the receipt in his hand, and he looked at Eastwood across the plastic chairs and the low table with the old magazines. "I was at Chosin," he said. "I know what it means when a man stands his ground." He paused. "Thank you." Eastwood looked at him for a moment. He nodded once, the way men nod when words would make something smaller. Then he pushed through the door and walked out into the November morning. Walter Pruitt's consultation at 2:30 confirmed what he had known for 2 years. The compressed vertebra was going to require surgery. The VA coverage, once reinstated, would cover most of it. The surgery was scheduled for the spring. The procedure went well. The recovery took 8 weeks. He was back on the ranch by July. His daughter Carol, who had driven him to his follow-up appointments through the winter, and who had watched her father walk without the compensating stiffness he had carried for as long as she could remember, asked him once that spring what had changed. He told her about the hospital in November. He told her about the $47 and the man who had set it on the counter. He told her what the man had said. The government just hasn't paid you yet. Consider this an advance on what they owe you. Carol Pruitt remembered the story. She wrote it down in the journal she kept, which was something her mother had started her doing when she was 12, and which she continued her entire adult life. The entry is dated April 14th, 1969. It runs to 3 pages. The last paragraph reads, "Pop said he tried to find out an address to send the money back to, and the man was already through the door. He said he could have tracked him down probably, but that he didn't. He said some debts you pay forward, not back, and that he had been thinking about how to do that ever since November." Walter Pruitt paid it forward twice in the years that followed. In 1972, he paid the outstanding balance on a medical bill for a young farm worker from Gonzales who had broken his arm on the ranch and had no coverage. In 1976, he covered 3 months of heating oil for an elderly widow in his neighborhood in Salinas when her fixed income ran short in December. He did not tell either of them where he had learned to do it. He did not think that was the point. There is a particular understanding that certain kinds of experience produce, not wisdom in the abstract advice column sense, but a specific and practical knowledge of what it means to be in a room when someone needs something and to have the ability to provide it. Walter Pruitt had spent 20 years watching his country send young men into situations that produced that understanding at significant cost and then bring them home and lose their paperwork. He had been one of those men. He knew what it felt like to be standing at a window $47 short with nowhere else to go. He made sure that the men and women who ended up in his version of that room, the farm worker with the broken arm, the widow with the heating bill, and others over the years whose names his daughter Carol documented carefully in her journals, did not have to feel it. He died in 1989 at 72. The back had held. He had walked without the stiffness for 20 years. Carol Pruitt donated her journals to the Monterey Public Library in 2003. The collection runs to 41 volumes. The April 1969 entry about the hospital in November has been read by researchers and visitors enough times that the page has been transferred to an archival sleeve to preserve it. A small notation beside the entry in the library's catalog reads, "References, Clint Eastwood, Monterey, November 1968. Clint Eastwood never spoke about the morning at the hospital. He would not. It was $47.05 in a waiting room, and he would have found the suggestion that it required acknowledgement genuinely puzzling. He had done something that needed doing because he was in the room when it needed doing. He went back to whatever came next, that is, when you have been paying attention, simply how he works." The country sent Walter Pruitt to Incheon in 1950. It sent him to the Chosin Reservoir in the worst winter in a generation and expected him to survive it, and then sent him home and lost his paperwork. $47 was not what it owed him. $47 was the smallest possible gesture in the direction of a debt that could not actually be paid. Eastwood understood that. He made the gesture anyway, because the gesture was available, and Walter Pruitt was standing in front of him, and the $47 was in his pocket. Some things don't require more justification than that. The door of the hospital swings both ways. On one side, the waiting room, the plastic chairs, the fluorescent light, the admissions window, the clerk who is not unkind and cannot bend the policy. On the other side, the November morning, the parking lot, the rest of the day, the rest of the life. Clint Eastwood walked through it and kept going. Walter Pruitt went in for his 2:30 consultation and came home that evening and told his daughter what had happened, and she wrote it down so it would not be lost. It was not lost. There's a version of this story where the $47 is the point, where a famous man's generosity is the headline and the veteran is the backdrop. That version misses what actually happened. What actually happened is that a man who had given something real in 1950 was standing in a room in 1968, being told that the system designed to care for him was $47 short of being able to do so. And another man in that room saw it and made it right because he was there, and the money was in his pocket, and the alternative was to walk past it. The $47 was not generosity, it was arithmetic. The debt was Walter Pruitt's back and his leg and his ear and the 17 days at Chosin. The $47 was the smallest possible movement in the direction of settling it. Eastwood understood that. He made the gesture anyway, because the gesture was available and Walter Pruitt was standing in front of him and the $47 was in his pocket. Some things don't require more justification than that. If this story stayed with you, share it with a veteran in your life. Not because it will change anything, but because the men who stood their ground at places like Chosen deserve to know that some people remember what that cost. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We rate everyone.